Welcome to FemLead, the podcast on female leadership and role models. Prepare to feel inspired and better equipped to navigate your career path. I am Alexandra Chabotaru, your host, and together with my guests, we will tackle a new field of work in each episode. The aim of this podcast is to deep dive into career perspectives and strategies to navigate your desired path for success. Enjoy! Hello, everyone, and welcome to a new episode of FemLead. Today, we discuss impact investing, how to change the world through healthcare by creating impact businesses. My next guest is the founder of Emerging Health Ventures in Stockholm, Sweden. She headed the life science investment team at Industrifonden, a 500 million euros venture capital fund, and previous experience also includes the role of vice president strategy and ventures at Gambro AB, in Sweden, and management consulting at Boston Consulting Group in Stockholm and New York. She serves on the boards of a nonprofit hospital and healthcare organization. She holds a PhD in molecular neurobiology and a master's in biomedicine, both from the Karolinska Institute, including research done at Columbia University in New York. This is really amazing to hear. Recognition for her work includes the selection as a young global leader by the World Economic Forum and a 40 under 40 European young leader by Friends of Europe, Europa Nova. So many achievements. Please welcome today our guest, Dr. Nina Rawal. Welcome, Nina. It's really an honor to have you here. How are you today?
Well, thank you so much for having me. I'm good and I'm excited to be here.
I'm so excited that we actually met for this interview. I was part of your presentation a few months ago during a Global Shapers community meetup, where you've talked about very important topics like we will also tackle today, healthcare and how to basically change the world by focusing on the right problems and trying to solve them. And today we are going to talk about emerging health ventures. We are going to talk about your setup where you are building a fund, a venture fund, and we are going to talk about how do you use your capabilities to actually create this change in the world. So thank you so much for making the time and for joining us today. Healthcare is a very important topic that we should all tackle, especially nowadays. And I would like to start by asking you, what is exactly impact investing? Just tell us more about the scope of your work. Why is this an important subject to know about? And what should we all know about the topic overall?
Yeah, well, thank you. I mean, that's the logical place to start. And it's also a really big question in terms of what is impact investing, because I think it's one of these words that have become like a vessel and different people fill it with different contents. But I guess in general, the most basic description is, I suppose, investing towards some kind of positive impact. And then you would say, well, isn't that always the case? And I guess you could say that, the investors in ExxonMobil or something else, that's not necessarily investing towards, for example, the Sustainable Development Goals. So a lot of people try to tie what they're doing towards those goals because it's a framework that most people know and can kind of unite again around. So impact investing is really, investing towards some kind of positive impact. And I think in life science, you could say, and some people say that, everything is impact, positive impact, because it all has to do with people's health. And I would say yes, but the whole fundamental, what we're trying to do is really saying, that the vast majority of innovation and new products that come to market are great for us, us lucky ones, the 1 billion living in high income countries. But the current innovation model doesn't really take into account the remaining 6 billion people, that don't either live in healthcare systems where the government can pay, or where you have kind of strong insurance schemes. And so knowing that most people in the world die of the same causes, whether it's Alzheimer's disease or cancer or diabetes, we're just trying to challenge that model where we're saying, why walk away, or why leave such a big part of the market on the table? Why wouldn't you want to develop products that can be sold across the whole world, reach more people, and kind of treat those people for their diseases, but also generating a financial return by doing so. So we like to talk about double double bottom line where we think about financial returns and social returns. So that's impact investing for us.
And when you say that we need to take care of each other, a very, very important part of this conversation, you mentioned the 1 billion versus the remaining 6 billion. And I feel that, of course, many people who listen to this podcast are most likely in the billion that we have discussed now, where we have access to free healthcare or at reasonable prices healthcare, places where you can get a private insurance and you are able to cover it. But of course, we need to consider the rest of the world. And I do want to put things a bit in perspective based on how I was raised. It was always important to know that there are people around that cannot have the same opportunities. And I think that in this noisy setup that we are in now, and in this world of, social media, very, very fast moving business models and very fast moving cases where companies, overnight they get acquired and so on. Where does this topic play an important role? Because I'm not sure who should be those people that move the needle in the direction of change when it comes to impact investing. So how can I personally do something, because I'm not part of that sort of narrative. And maybe I will never be if I'm not interested to find out. So if you can detail for us, who are the people that should really push forward this topic of impact investing, and how can we individually contribute to helping everybody and not just ourselves?
Okay, so let me break that question down. It's a big one. I mean, first and foremost, I think the pandemic is a great example of what, the disparities you speak to, because we, the lucky ones, we are getting access to vaccines, and our countries have been hoarding vaccines so that the rest of the world cannot get access to them, which is such a dichotomy in terms, because we all know that everyone needs the same vaccine for this virus to really go away. I mean, we understand herd immunity, but still we act in a very different way. And it's partly because, we can pay better and we can get access to these vaccines before others can. So I think take the example of AstraZeneca versus Pfizer, where AstraZeneca has said, okay, we're going to make the vaccine available at $2.50 or whatever it is, and they partner with Serum Institute of India, compared to Pfizer, who goes, let's say, the more traditional route. So I think I'm just mentioning it because you see this playing out in real time in this times of the pandemic. Now, to your other question of, why should people care? Well, I think there are multiple ways to care. One way is to become an impact investor, and we'll get back to that later, I think. But also, most of us work. And through that, we earn our pensions, and they are invested through pension funds. So we can be asking the question, which more and more people are doing, where is that capital invested? What does it go to? Does it go to oil? Does it go to other things? Or does it go to, the green economy and, healthcare and so on? So I think we should never underestimate that power. And I think in terms of power and what can we do as, a small, simple consumer somewhere? I mean, just look at the power of a 16-year-old girl, Greta Thunberg, who could, mobilize the whole world. So, whether that's if you're a climate activist or what you are, I mean, there's so many ways of engaging, but I think that we all have power, and we shouldn't underestimate it. And I think it's more about deciding, how do you channel that engagement? Is it through becoming an impact investor? Is it through working for the government? Because I think, governments are super important in this equation too, to drive change and all of that. Or do you work for the UN? I mean, there's so many things you can do, but we all really can and need to do and contribute to positive change.
Very well said. I want to ask, for those of our listeners who have no intention of either becoming an impact investor, even though we will discuss very soon what does that actually entail, working for a government, or joining a international organization such as UN, what else can we do to stay up to date with what is happening around the world? Because we all follow the media, and we do know that the media has a tendency of showcasing negative news and focusing less on the updates and evolutions of different fields of work. we know that we are, some of us that have maybe a corporate job, an office job, maybe we have been educated and we work in companies that are in totally different fields of work. We have less, we give less importance to actually being all the time up to date, because most of the time the news are not good. So we focus a lot on the negative updates around the world. And for some people, that's a lot. Like if you have a stressful job, or if you simply want to focus on your well-being and, how you build your life, hearing all of those thoughts can really be um, not good for your development as an adult. How else can we tackle this so it doesn't become, I feel the question here is, how can we do a little bit or start somewhere so we don't also feel the pressure of the world on our shoulders, but actually contribute significantly to change? Because as you said, if you have a mass of people that really decide to work together on a mission, you can mobilize masses after that, and it becomes a movement, right? And we've seen it in the last few years with Greta, we've seen it with racial injustice, we've seen it with other important topics to discuss, like gender equality, access to education, access to public healthcare, and so on. How can we all contribute?
Well, it's a big and a small question all at once. I would say, if you set out to change the whole question or the whole problem, then of course it will be very overwhelming. I totally agree. But whether it is finding, a charitable cause or an NGO that you can support financially, or, work with them in your free time. I mean, I think it's a source of a lot of inspiration, and we'll get back to that, but like it's a source of energy also. And I agree with you with the negative news. I mean, it's who does not feel that in the pandemic? But I think there are other sources, that allows for the long read, where you can see the progress is that's being done as well, and you get the nuances. I mean, Hans Rosling wrote this fantastic book about factfulness, about all the things that are improved in the world. I mean, so whether it's through literature, and I actually think that literature and culture are such fantastic sources of, looking at the world with a different lens and kind of reflection, whether it's that, or it's supporting an NGO, or, creating your own, or I think it's that is actually secondary, I would say. I think it starts with really feeling that agency and power that everyone has, because we do. And I think the less we cultivate that, the more distanced we become to the opportunity to create change and contribute to positive change in the world. So I think it starts there.
Very well said. So if anybody is interested in joining any initiatives where we do see that change happens, and where teams are really organized and they're really trying to create that impact in communities, because it starts from a community and it evolves throughout the country, this region, the setup that you're in, really try to find out your local organizations.
And one thing I wanted to say also, because I mean, you are young, and you I'm sure you have a healthy group of young listeners there. And I would really also encourage, if you really want to contribute to positive change, I mean, science is a perfect way to start, because the vast majority of science really makes the world better. Whether it's life science or technical science or whatever it might be, data, it's all positive. But also really like thinking about governmental jobs and the ones that tend to be a bit less, should we call it, sexy right now, because the narrative is around, entrepreneurship. And I will never speak against entrepreneurship, but I really think we shouldn't underestimate how big factor governments represent in creating change. So maybe it's less glossy, but I think you can really have huge impact by going into government. It's kind of obvious, but also not obvious, because when you speak to youngsters, it doesn't seem to be top of mind. So just recommending that as well.
Thank you very much for that, Nina. That's also very important to note. I do want to continue on this thread of impact investing. Tell us, how do you become an impact investor, and what does that mean?
Yeah, well, that's there are many ways to get to Rome, let's say. So, I'm very atypical in the sense that I started in the scientific world, and like you mentioned, very summarized very well. My background was in biomedicine, and then I chose to specialize in neuroscience. So, that path was not automatically into impact investing. We can talk about that, but yeah, I started in science and crossed over to business. And I think most people maybe start in business and they find this niche, and whether it's the green economy or life science related or whatever, AI, whatever it might be. So I'd say most people are go to business school and then they end up in impact investing. And I think it's probably because like, due to the conversation we just had around, what do you want to contribute to? What's your sense of purpose and what you're trying to do? So I think that's the typical situation.
And for those of our listeners who are interested in contributing and are interested in joining a, let's say, a venture fund, let's say, venture capital, and generally joining the venture world. I've had a full episode on it with Suheila from BMW Ventures, and they invest in the mobility space and startups, green mobility, and so on. How do you enter this space if you, let's say we don't have, most of my listeners, I think they don't have a life science background, and as you said, your journey is quite special in the sense because you've decided to transition and go to business. But for those of our listeners who don't have a scientific background, how do you get started? How do you find these opportunities to really help by joining a team that can impact the world, so to speak?
Well, so I think if you want to do life science investing, meaning like investing in pharmaceuticals or vaccines and diagnostics, then I think a life science training, one or the other format, is a good thing. There are these courses typically that you can take, even if you're a business graduate. You can take a year of courses at a medical faculty, and that's going to take you a long way. So I mean, you don't have to go all the way to PhD, but I do think you need to understand the space you operate in, and it is a very kind of specialized sector. So I think usually we are all PhDs for a reason, and it's because we understand this space and feel comfortable around the details. But I mean, there's the health tech, which is the intersection between the digital side of healthcare. I think you don't need a PhD in neurobiology for that. So that's one space. But I mean, impact investing, of course, is everything that has to do with positive impact. So it's very much around sustainability from a green perspective, whether it's agricultural tech or food tech or all these other sectors, or for that matter, financial technology towards inclusive finance, where you're like banking parts of the world that didn't have access to the financial systems before. So I mean, impact investing comes in different flavors, and the general advice would be, if you're the business graduate, go out and get some experience in the field you're interested in. If you're interested in financial services, work in that area. If you're interested, so I think there are different ways of getting to becoming a partner in a VC firm, and I'm sure you explored it in that previous episode. But I would just say, I remain convinced that I'm super grateful for the years of experience I had before I came into VC, including some operational experience in the sector, because it's just so much easier when you're trying to put pressure on people to do things, and you're negotiating with them and so on, to be having walked in their shoes. I find it just makes everything easier, not to mention to understand the sector and the market dynamics and so on. So I would really encourage people to join a startup or join a big company. It doesn't really matter, but get some experience before you move into VC.
That's a very good advice, because I'm sure many of our listeners have thought about this idea. It is, of course, a not so popular path, I would say, and I focus my podcast on career paths, so it's definitely interesting to see how your career path evolved. But it's for sure an idea that we can share with our listeners, that once you've gained an experience in a specific field, you can look into, okay, how to help other companies evolve get funding, really create impact. And I'm really happy we talked today about healthcare and impact investing. Can you tell me, how do you measure impact? How do you measure the success of your endeavors now in this space?
Well, I mean, I guess you mean beyond the measure of financial returns, which is not so complicated. Well, in our sector, it really is about, lives saved, lives reached by certain products. So in that terms, it's very, so in that sense, it's very tangible, and you can really demonstrate that, and it tends to score very highly when it comes to impact. But then there are all the indirect effects on society. If you keep people healthy, healthy people are healthy workers, they're healthy patients. Patients, they're healthy parents. I mean, they're not patients. So all those kick-on effects of keeping people healthy and having a quality of life. And I mean, in this pandemic, we've seen, what happens when schools close, how does that impact in the individual, the family, society? And we also know that these things translate into kind of very clear effects on GDP and other growth metrics over time. So I would say it's partly the very clear metrics around lives saved and lives reached, but also the indirect effects of keeping people healthy. And we believe that both are kind of equally important.
Your company is called Emerging Health Ventures. And for me, that rings a bell on emerging markets. Is that correct? Is there a correlation there?
It's both emerging markets, but it's also that it's emerging. It's like it's the next wave, right? It's the up and coming. So it's yes, it's playing with both words or both associations. Yeah.
Perfect. How do we understand? How can we know, or what should we follow in order to understand how markets evolve in this sphere? Because healthcare is such a huge industry. And as you said, it has multiple stakeholders. You really need governments involved. If I'm interested in joining this field, for example, of emerging healthcare and technologies and so on, what should I look for? Like, what is it that I should really pay attention to?
And when you say pay attention to, you mean like the type of companies we look at, or
companies, markets, maybe some characteristics of, I don't know, it could be that you look at different focus areas when you select, what sort of industries, or what sort of companies, or what sort of players you want to have in the industry. So what are some characteristics of having a venture fund in this space?
That's a great question, because there are very few of them. So I think the characteristics are really back to where we started, which is that the challenge in our sector is that every company I look at it aims to make the world better, because they aim to reduce patient suffering, or saving lives, or whatever they do. So that does not make them a unique company in healthcare. That's kind of a ticket to the game. So then there are other things that that we need to take into account, such as willingness to pay, and what's the business model, and so on. And that's like traditional life science. And then, as we talked about in the beginning, I think the unique thing that we're trying to challenge is just to say, we know that the cause of death around the world, Alzheimer's, is more common than malaria. So it's great that people are, and all these NGOs are trying to develop medicines for malaria. But, if you look at the people or the organizations, companies developing treatments for Alzheimer's, I don't think any one of them is really aiming to make that a low-cost product that could be available across the world. And so that's really the mission we're on, to say we want to bring new therapies to patients, but we want to bring them at a price point that makes it possible for more people to pay for it, whether it's out of pocket, whether it's through an insurance scheme in India, whatever it might be. But just to say, we want to drive affordability in this sector, and that's kind of the defining characteristic of what we're doing. So when we look at companies that we want to invest in, we're basically saying, okay, interesting product, but how can we also make sure that the cost side of things is compatible with affordability, and how otherwise how could we do that, and how can we think about different types of pricing for different geographies. I mean, there are many ways to work around it, but that would really be like the glasses we have on, which are those of affordability.
Wow, what a mission, eh? I mean, considering the fact that you're talking about the 1 billion, and I must say, when you've mentioned that, I immediately also thought about factfulness, because I read it recently. And then reminding ourselves that there's 6 billion that will never afford, I don't know, a $3 pill that you can get from your pharmacy because it's just not part of their price point, right? How can you detail a bit, not necessarily for a specific setup, but can you detail for us, how does that process go? How do you tackle affordability in business when you know that most of the big players in this space, they really want to get the returns of their investments, and it's really, it's a big game, as we're talking about billions of dollars, or who knows, trillions, when we talk about healthcare. So how do you tackle affordability in such a space?
No, but that's a good question, and I think it's not a one size fits all. And by the way, affordability is a relative term. I mean, the cost of a vaccine, like we're talking about $1.50, that's probably never realistic for a new cancer treatment. I shouldn't say never, but like it's so affordability will always be a relative term. But the way we think about it is really to say, how can you find a win-win? Because these markets are not being tapped today. So in that sense, there's not a lot of competition, because most, new cancer drugs, if they are ever introduced in India, it might be, Thailand, Vietnam, whatever. It's usually 10 years after, 15 years after. So there's one thing around saying, okay, well, people don't seem, big pharma and others don't seem to focus on some of these geographies today. So how can we kind of find the win-win in doing that? But again, it's also around it on the vaccine side, for example, then the same cost, it's the same on the drug side, actually, that the same vaccine, the same drug is available for very, very different prices in different parts of the world. And so that's also one way to think about it, that there is some kind of acknowledgement that, it's not realistic that certain countries will be paying the same price. It's not Apple, where, the iPhone costs the same across the world. It doesn't work that way. So that's also one way to think about, how do you build a business case? Because in the end, you need to build a business case. Like you say, you need to find your return on investment, but you can also try to use those pricing mechanisms to find more return on investment in certain geographies than others, and so on. So, it's difficult to give a generic answer, but I think it's easy to say that it has to be at the heart of every evaluation, because if it isn't affordable in a relative sense, then it will not be scaled across those countries. So then we're not going to succeed.
Yes, very, very well said. And I'm very happy you tackled this question, because it is super important that whoever listens to us understands that there's so many relative terms around healthcare, and even innovation. And when we talk about doing different drug tests, the way it works and the way it's developed looks different also around the world, and the processes and the way that we move forward with some of those innovations. Yeah, it's never 100% the same. And what you're trying to do, it's also very, I want to say that it's a very nice mission, in the sense of really showing to everyone that if you focus your capabilities, knowledge, interest to this idea of saving the world in a way, or impacting the world, you can also be focused on an angle that will help you as well. Because usually, and I do want to hear your thoughts on this narrative, if you want to save the world, you should self-sacrifice. This is a narrative that exists in different parts of the world, that you should give your all to the mission, and that you shouldn't have any gains, and that you should be selfless, and so on. What is your stance on how to create impact from your perspective as an entrepreneur, and a person that built a venture fund?
Well, I think that's a good it's an interesting perspective. And I mean, I've spent I've been working with Doctors Without Borders in different capacities over the years, and I mean, they are very selfless in many ways, and so on. So there's a space for that, and I think the more you want to, and I don't mean it against MSF, but I mean it in the wider sense of saying the more you want to moralize, then I suppose the cleaner you need to be. Back to Greta Thunberg, I don't think it's a coincidence that she was a 16-year-old girl without any kind of history or, no baggage, no complications, because, humans are messy and we have to prioritize, and so I think you're right, but I also think, for me, that those kind of outer positions of, being an NGO or being ExxonMobil, I think that's never the solution forward. I come from Sweden. It's always about the middle ground and consensus and all these things. And I think there's something to it. So what we're trying to say is just, what does sustainability in the wider sense in our sector mean? Well, it means that someone needs to make money in this long term for it to continue, like just handing out grants and handing out food to people. Of course, it has to be done because we don't want people to starve today, but it's not going to change the system. So how do you contribute to change? And that's where we're trying to say, if there's a market failure, then we have to address that and try to create a market. So that's why I actually find within healthcare that it's definitely possible, and I think it's possible in other sectors as well, to say that, yeah, what does sustainability in terms of long-term sustainability mean? Well, I think it means that someone needs to have an incentive to do something in the long term, and that's usually, in the way the world works, some kind of financial incentive, but it doesn't have to be sky high, so it doesn't have to be all or nothing. It's usually in the gray. And I wanted to just recommend to everyone interested in impact investing, I would really recommend this book on this topic called Winners Take All, The Elite Charade of Changing the World by Anand Giridharadas. And it's, I think it's a really healthy challenge of impact investing. And like, he basically criticizes everything I do, and I love it. I think it's a really good book because it's really challenging, the cause, like, or rather the origin, like all these wealthy people that built up their wealth based on this very unequal and unfair system. And now they're, the fact that they're trying to impact invest, does it actually perpetuate the inequality, as opposed to, for example, going into government and kind of changing things that way for everyone in society at once, and so on. So I think it's a good place to start, because it really makes you think through, where can I try to achieve positive change? And for me, it still ends up being in this space. But I think it's a healthy challenge to start with.
Thank you so much for that, Nina. Thank you for sharing your thoughts, and thank you for being also very, showcasing to all of us that it doesn't need to be all or nothing, which is a narrative that I've also tried to challenge. And it's really about, personal journey and how you can create a positive change that will also benefit you in the long run. Because of course, like you've said, this is for you a business setup where you really try to create change. And you're not so many players, so everybody's trying to do the best. And it's really a great mission to have. So thanks a lot for sharing that. I do want to continue talking a bit about your career path, because I am very interested in the way you switched from life sciences to business. What were the incentives behind that? So would it be possible to tell us a bit about what made you decide to cross over on the business side and decide to start your own fund? Is there anything that changed in the way that I don't know, your career was progressing in life sciences, something you've noticed or something you've realized and decided to make this switch?
Yeah, no. So, I started off in academic science. First of all, my father is a medical doctor, my brother's a medical doctor, my mother's a dentist. So, not being in life science or healthcare was, that came at the dinner table. I didn't know anything else, and I'm very grateful for it, because I think it's the most fascinating field. So but then I started in science. I think I knew pretty early on that I did not want to go into the clinical side of things, like the daily clinical side of things. And so science was really attractive to me. And I really like, I still really like science. So, and it's a big part of my job, to understand, because science is always the underlying business idea in what we look at. So that's always there. That's still there. But I equally, pretty early on, I think I still realized that science is not my end destination. I don't, that's not where I see myself. And I'm sure, given that you interview women, I'm sure you've had this conversation in like a gazillion different forums around, role models and career paths and all those things. And the career path was there actually, but yeah, maybe there were a lack of role models, but also I'm very driven by curiosity, and so I think I felt like staying in one one area was not for me. And so I was en route to New York for a postdoc, and I was also on the way home very honest with myself to say that it was more New York and less more years in science. And so I decided to interview with BCG, the Boston Consulting Group, and that was my pivot into business. And it was a very difficult decision at the time, because I was kind of closing my door to that career path, what I knew, to kind of enter the unknown. Looking back, it was not a difficult decision at all, but it was really big then. I think that's not totally unusual. But I will say that, I was mainly trained as a scientist. My way of approaching the world is through science. So, or, like the critical thinking and so on. So it wasn't like moving into the business world was all easy. There are other drawbacks there, clearly. There are other trade-offs. And so maybe, I grew up between cultures, and I think it's the same here. These are very different cultures. On most days, I think it's an asset to move in between and have a mix of both. But of course, it has its challenges. And I think that's probably one reason why I moved into impact investing, because, the purpose of science combined with kind of the results orientation and the clear goals and all of that of the business world, I feel is a good mix. So yeah, maybe a long answer, but that's how it ended up happening.
I'm happy you shared your journeys, because I think it's super important to also put a bit of a spotlight on how you've transitioned. And, it's not the first time that I'm hearing that, having a career in a different industry, moving into business, happened through consulting, because of course, that is also very important for different clients that require your capabilities and knowledge to better their strategy, to create those sort of plans that will really eventually impact the world as well. We need people that really have the skills in order to get the right advice. So I'm not surprised, and I also feel that, like you said, now looking back, it was the right decision for you, but maybe it was difficult at the time. And going on this thread of looking back, do you have any lessons from your career development that you can share with us? 2-3 ideas that you think would really help our listeners?
I think the first one is really, it's maybe a cliche, but I think it's true. Follow your interests, and the opportunities will present themselves. And I've heard that in so many different ways throughout my career. And, you're like, yeah, that's easy for you to say because you are now Mr. or Mrs. X and Y and you're all accomplished. And, what do I know at the beginning of my career? But I still think that's true, because if you're driven by curiosity and interest, the ride is interesting. Then it's not only about the goal. And I see some of my friends, especially maybe from consulting, because it's kind of less, interest driven. Some of them, as they moved on, it feels like it was more about finding those specific roles and less about the content. And I would worry that it ends up feeling a bit like contentless, a bit empty over time. So I think being driven by interest is really important. The second one would really still be that, being very driven by curiosity and content. In the beginning, I focused a lot on that. And I think I focused less on, who's my boss and which are the, people in my immediate vicinity? And can I be successful in that environment? And I think that was a mistake I did. I'm not sure everyone else does it, but I did that. I was very focused on the task and delivering on the task instead of thinking about who are the people, and do we view the world the same way? And if we don't, what does that mean for my likelihood to succeed? So I finding a balance, and the more junior you are, the less you can choose, but the more you can find someone who's really on your team, a boss who's really on your team, or who wants you to succeed. I think those would be the main advice.
Thank you so much for that. It's so true. And I'm also happy that, maybe this was also a reflection exercise for you to realize, the importance of career development. Now you're going on this path where it's probably more challenging than knowing you have a client at the door waiting for your advice. So it's also interesting to know if you can, tell us a bit about how do you feel now in your path? What are some of the challenges or interesting facts that you've discovered once you've started on the venture world?
Well, I think, and especially, like going off on your own, because I think that's, I'm full of admiration for all the people that have the courage. I think courage is such a, it's thrown around, but it's such a huge thing. And I think I've really learned about that over the past 2 years as I've, gone off into the unknown with this really big ambition in that sense. And that you need courage, but you also need the resilience, because you swim. I take the analogy that you swim, you leave the shore and you swim a little bit every day. And all of a sudden you're really far away from the shore and you don't really know, in certain moments, you don't know where you're going. So you don't know how to go back. You don't know how to go. The only thing you can do is continue going. And that can be a bit scary, but that's when you need the courage and the resilience. And you asked me about kind of things to recommend, and I just wanted to recommend everyone, because that's kind of regardless of what you're trying to do, but to read The Man in the Arena speech by Theodore Roosevelt. He wrote it more than 100 years ago, but it's so relevant, and it starts, and I won't read the whole thing, but it starts with it's not the critics that count. It's really about the people who dare to be in the arena, who try to create change, because it's so easy to sit on the side in your really cushy, comfy, warm environment and criticize the people that try to create change, but it's so hard to do it. So I think I'm thinking a lot about that right now. How do you find strength and inspiration and courage in continuing and keep going.
Wow. How thoughtful, and thanks so much for taking the time to share this with us, because I thought it was very, very inspiring. When you've mentioned the quote, I remember, I think Brené Brown shared it in one of her TED Talks when she talks about how she overnight, after she was I think a psychologist, or maybe she was doing research, I'm not sure, I don't want to say something that's wrong, but she became famous overnight based on her research. And then she started getting criticism from all over the place. And she really had to have a conversation with herself, like, should I really care as much about it? Because none of these people have been in my shoes and they don't know what I'm going through. And they have no understanding of what my work means. So, like, is it fair to be giving my energy here, or to give it to the people that really want to support and continue and I make a change for, So inspiring and thoughtful. Thanks so much for sharing that.
No, I actually seen a clip of that, and I had already read the speech, but it just made me think about it again. And I think, maybe it's especially interesting for women who tend to internalize much more. You get criticized and you think it's about you. I think there's a gender a difference there compared to, just brushing it off. And someone once gave me this advice, and I really, really try. I try every day. It's not easy, but I try to hold on to it, which is, don't take criticism from someone whose advice you wouldn't take. So, if you don't respect that person, meaning whatever respect means, but like, if you don't value that person's advice, then don't pay that person's criticism too much attention. So, there are different ways of thinking about it, but I think it's for all the people considering to go off and to do something on their own. I think this is a chapter you really need to think through, and not just once. It's kind of continuous. how you stay in the game, because it's very easy to just say, it's too tough. I'll just go and take a nice job and lean back a bit.
Super. Thank you so much, Nina, for sharing this this very inspiring last piece of advice here with what you've been through as an entrepreneur and trying to make this journey on your own. So congrats for doing this. I think it's really inspiring. I really like the topic and everything that you've shared with us. I want to sum up. If you have anything that you want to share with us before closing this interview, is there anything that you wish you knew at the beginning of your career?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a tricky one, because I'm still learning, right? But if one, I would choose this thing about setbacks, because there will be setbacks, and what do you do with them? And if you can try to see them as a way to build resilience, and that they're kind of preparing you for future success by being ready, I think that's a much better way of thinking about setbacks than just seeing them as kind of unfair, or not what you wanted, and so on. And I think we all struggle with that. It's very difficult to say in hindsight, very difficult when you're in the midst of it, because it's tough, but you need you need a few of those. Very few players win the Wimbledon the first attempt. Most of us need to practice a few times, so with that perspective, it's a bit more empathetic with yourself, and probably a bit more healthy.
Thank you so much, Nina. Thank you so much for this interview. It was really great to have you join us in FemLead, and I'm very happy that I shared your story with our community. I will link all of the links that the people need to know in order to find you, find your company, understand more about your mission. And again, thanks for taking the time today.
Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you all for tuning in, and stay tuned for more interviews with female role models. I hope you felt inspired to take charge of your next career move. Remember to review this podcast and share your comments. Thank you.